Chapter 5, Part 2 of The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, by Charles Darwin. Read for LibriVox.org by Michael Armenda. Distinct species present analogous variations, so that a variety of one species often assumes a character proper to an allied species, or reverts to some of the characters of an early progenitor. These propositions will be most readily understood by looking to our domestic races. The most distinct breeds of the pigeon, in countries widely apart, present sub-varieties with reversed feathers on the head and with feathers on the feet, characters not possessed by the aboriginal rock pigeon. These, then, are analogous variations in two or more distinct races. The frequent presence of 14 or even 16 tail feathers in the pouter may be considered as a variation representing the normal structure of another race, the fantail. I presume that no one will doubt that all such analogous variations are due to the several races of the pigeon having inherited from a common parent the same constitution and tendency to variation when acted on by similar unknown influences. In the vegetable kingdom, we have a case of analogous variation in the enlarged stems, or as commonly called, roots, of the Swedish turnip and rutabaga plants, which several botanists rank as varieties produced by cultivation from a common parent. If this be not so, the case will then be one of analogous variation in two so-called distinct species. And to these a third may be added, namely, the common turnip. According to the ordinary view of each species having been independently created, we should have to attribute this similarity in the enlarged stems of these three plants, not to the vera causa of community of descent, and a consequent tendency to vary in a like manner, but to three separate yet closely related acts of creation. Many similar cases of analogous variations have been observed by Naudin in the great gourd family, and by various authors in our serials. Similar cases occurring with insects under natural conditions have lately been discussed with much ability by Mr. Walsh, who has grouped them under his law of equable variability. With pigeons, however, we have another case, namely the occasional appearance in all the breeds of slaty blue birds with two black bars on the wings, white loins, a bar at the end of the tail, with the outer feathers externally edged near their bases with white. As all these marks are characteristic of the parent rock pigeon, I presume that no one will doubt that this is a case of reversion, and not of a new yet analogous variation appearing in the several breeds. We may, I think, confidently come to this conclusion, because, as we have seen, these colored marks are eminently liable to appear in the crossed offspring of two distinct and differently colored breeds. And in this case, there is nothing in the external conditions of life to cause the reappearance of the slaty blue, with the several marks, beyond the influence of the mere act of crossing on the laws of inheritance. No doubt it is a very surprising fact that characters should reappear after having been lost for many, probably for hundreds of generations. But when a breed has been crossed only once by some other breed, the offspring occasionally show for many generations a tendency to revert in character to the foreign breed, some say for a dozen or even a score of generations. After 12 generations, the proportion of blood, to use a common expression, from one ancestor is only 1 in 2,048, and yet, as we see, it is generally believed that a tendency to reversion is retained by this remnant of foreign blood, in a breed which has not been crossed, but in which both parents have lost some character which their progenitor possessed. The tendency, whether strong or weak, to reproduce the lost character might, as was formerly remarked, for all that we can see to the contrary, be transmitted for almost any number of generations. When a character which has been lost in a breed reappears after a great number of generations, the most probable hypothesis is not that one individual suddenly takes after an ancestor removed by some 100 generations, but that in each successive generation the character in question has been lying latent, and at last, under unknown favourable conditions, is developed. With the barb pigeon, for instance, which very rarely produces a blue bird, it is probable that there is a latent tendency in each generation to produce blue plumage. The abstract improbability of such a tendency being transmitted through a vast number of generations is not greater than that of quite useless or rudimentary organs being similarly transmitted. A mere tendency to produce a rudiment is indeed sometimes thus inherited. As all the species of the same genus are supposed to be descended from a common progenitor, it might be expected that they would occasionally vary in an analogous manner, so that the varieties of two or more species would resemble each other, or that a variety of one species would resemble in certain characters another and distinct species, this other species being, according to our view, only a well-marked and permanent variety. But characters exclusively due to analogous variation would probably be of an unimportant nature, for the preservation of all functionally important characters will have been determined through natural selection, in accordance with the different habits of the species. It might further be expected that the species of the same genus would occasionally exhibit reversions to long-lost characters. As, however, we do not know the common ancestor of any natural group, we cannot distinguish between reversionary and analogous characters. If, for instance, we did not know that the parent rock pigeon was not feather-footed or turn-crowned, we could not have told whether such characters in our domestic breeds were reversions or only analogous variations, but we might have inferred that the blue color was a case of reversion from the number of the markings which are correlated with this tint, and which would not probably have all appeared together from simple variation. More especially we might have inferred this from the blue color, and the several marks so often appearing when differently colored breeds are crossed. Hence, although under nature it must generally be left doubtful what cases are reversions to formerly existing characters, and what are new but analogous variations, yet we ought, on our theory, sometimes to find the varying offspring of a species assuming characters which are already present in other members of the same group, and this undoubtedly is the case. The difficulty in distinguishing variable species is largely due to the varieties mocking, as it were, other species of the same genus. A considerable catalogue also could be given of forms, intermediate between two other forms which themselves can only doubtfully be ranked as species, and this shows, unless all these closely allied forms be considered as independently created species, that they have, in varying, assumed some of the characters of the others. But the best evidence of analogous variations is afforded by parts or organs which are generally constant in character, but which occasionally vary so as to resemble, in some degree, the same part or organ in an allied species. I have collected a long list of such cases, but here, as before, I lie under the great disadvantage of not being able to give them. I can only repeat that such cases certainly occur, and seem to me very remarkable. I will, however, give one curious and complex case, not indeed as affecting any important character, but from occurring in several species of the same genus, partly under domestication and partly under nature. It is a case almost certainly of reversion. The ass sometimes has very distinct transverse bars on its legs, like those on the legs of a zebra. It has been asserted that these are plainest in the foal, and from inquiries which I have made, I believe this to be true. The stripe on the shoulder is sometimes double, and is very variable in length and outline. A white ass, but not an albino, has been described without either spinal or shoulder stripe, and these stripes are sometimes very obscure, or actually quite lost in dark-coloured asses. The Coulon of Pallas is said to have been seen with a double shoulder stripe. Mr. Blyth has seen a specimen of the Hemonius with a distinct shoulder stripe, though it properly has none, and I have been informed by Colonel Poole that foals of this species are generally striped on the legs and faintly on the shoulder. The Quagga, though so plainly barred, like a zebra over the body, is without bars on the legs. But Dr. Gray has figured one specimen with very distinct zebra-like bars on the hocks. With respect to the horse, I have collected cases in England of all the spinal stripe in horses of the most distinct breeds, and of all colours. Transverse bars on the legs are not rare in duns, mouse duns, and in one instance in a chestnut. A faint shoulder stripe may sometimes be seen in duns, and I have seen a trace in a bay horse. My son made a careful examination and sketch for me of a dun Belgian cart horse with a double stripe on each shoulder, and with leg stripes. I have myself seen a dun Devonshire pony, and a small dun Welsh pony has been carefully described to me, both with 3 parallel stripes on each shoulder. In the northwest part of India, the Kattiwar breed of horses is so generally striped that, as I hear from Colonel Poole, who examined this breed for the Indian government, a horse without stripes is not considered as purely bred. The spine is always striped, the legs are generally barred, and the shoulder stripe, which is sometimes double and sometimes treble, is common. The side of the face, moreover, is sometimes striped. The stripes are often plainest in the foal, and sometimes quite disappear in old horses. Colonel Poole has seen both grey and bay Kattiwar horses striped when first foaled. I have also reason to suspect, from information given me by Mr. W. Edwards, that with the English race-horse, the spinal stripe is much commoner in the foal than in the full-grown animal. I have myself recently bred a foal from a bay mare, offspring of a Turcoman horse, and a Flemish mare, by a bay English race-horse. This foal, when a week old, was marked on its hinder quarters and on its forehead with numerous very narrow dark zebra-like bars, and its legs were feebly striped. All the stripes soon disappeared completely. Without here entering on further details, I may state that I have collected cases of leg and shoulder stripes in horses of very different breeds in various countries, from Britain to eastern China, and from Norway in the north to the Malay archipelago in the south. In all parts of the world these stripes occur far oftenest in duns and mouse duns. By the term dun, a large range of colour is included, from one between brown and black to a close approach to cream colour. I am aware that Colonel Hamilton Smith, who has written on this subject, believes that the several breeds of the horse are descended from several aboriginal species, one of which, the dun, was striped, and that the above described appearances are all due to ancient crosses with the dun stock. But this view may be safely rejected, for it is highly improbable that the heavy Belgian cart horse, Welsh ponies, Norwegian cobs, the lanky Kattiwar race, etc., inhabiting the most distant parts of the world, should have all been crossed with one supposed aboriginal stock. Now, let us turn to the effects of crossing the several species of the horse genus. Rollin asserts that the common mule, from the ass and horse, is particularly apt to have bars on its legs, according to Mr. Goss. In certain parts of the United States, about 9 out of 10 mules have striped legs. I once saw a mule with its legs so much striped that any one might have thought that it was a hybrid zebra. And Mr. W.C. Martin, in his excellent treatise on the horse, has given a figure of a similar mule. In 4 coloured drawings, which I have seen, of hybrids between the ass and zebra, the legs were much more plainly barred than the rest of the body, and in one of them there was a double shoulder stripe. In Lord Morton's famous hybrid, from a chestnut mare and male quagga, the hybrid, and even the pure offspring subsequently produced from the same mare by a black Arabian sire, were much more plainly barred across the legs than is even the pure quagga. Lastly, and this is another most remarkable case, a hybrid has been figured by Dr. Gray, and he informs me that he knows of a second case, from the ass and the hemionus, and this hybrid, though the ass only occasionally has stripes on his legs, and the hemionus has none, and is not even a shoulder stripe, nevertheless had all 4 legs barred, and had 3 short shoulder stripes, like those on the dun Devonshire and Welsh ponies, and even had some zebra-like stripes on the sides of its face. With respect to this last fact, I was so convinced that not even a stripe of colour appears from what is commonly called chance, that I was led solely from the occurrence of the faced stripes on this hybrid from the ass and hemionus to ask Colonel Poole whether such faced stripes ever occurred in the eminently striped Catty-War breed of horses, and was, as we have seen, answered in the affirmative. What now are we to say to these several facts? We see several distinct species of the horse genus becoming, by simple variation, striped on the legs like a zebra, or striped on the shoulders like an ass. In the horse, we see this tendency strong whenever a dun tint appears, a tint that approaches to that of the general colouring of the other species of the genus. The appearance of the stripes is not accompanied by any change of form, or by any other new character. We see this tendency to become striped most strongly displayed in hybrids from between several of the most distinct species. Now, observe the case of the several breeds of pigeons. They are descended from a pigeon, including 2 or 3 subspecies, or geographical races, of a bluish colour, with certain bars and other marks, and when any breed assumes by simple variation a bluish tint, these bars and other marks invariably reappear, but without any other change of form or character. When the oldest and truest breeds of various colours are crossed, we see a strong tendency for the blue tint and bars and marks to reappear in the mongrels. I have stated that the most probable hypothesis to account for the reappearance of very ancient characters is that there is a tendency in the young of each successive generation to produce the long-lost character, and that this tendency, from unknown causes, sometimes prevails, and we have just seen that in several species of the horse genus the stripes are either plainer or appear more commonly in the young than in the old. Call the breeds of pigeons, some of which have bred true for centuries, species, and how exactly parallel is the case with that of the species of the horse genus! For myself, I venture confidently to look back thousands on thousands of generations, and I see an animal striped like a zebra, but perhaps otherwise very differently constructed, the common parent of our domestic horse, whether or not it be descended from one or more wild stocks, of the ass, the hemionus, quagga, and zebra. He who believes that each equine species was independently created will, I presume, assert that each species has been created with a tendency to vary, both under nature and under domestication, in this particular manner, so as often to become striped like the other species of the genus, and that which has been created with a strong tendency, when crossed with species inhabiting distant quarters of the world, to produce hybrids resembling in their stripes not their own parents, but other species of the genus. To admit this view is, as it seems to me, to reject a real for an unreal, or at least for an unknown cause. It makes the works of God a mere mockery and deception. I would almost as soon believe with the old and ignorant cosmogonists that fossil shells had never lived, but had been created in stone so as to mock the shells now living on the seashore. Summary. Our ignorance of the laws of variation is profound. Not in one case out of 100 can we pretend to assign any reason why this or that part has varied. But whenever we have the means of instituting a comparison, the same laws appear to have acted in producing the lesser differences between varieties of the same species, and the greater differences between species of the same genus. Changed conditions generally induce mere fluctuating variability, but sometimes they cause direct and definite effects, and these may become strongly marked in the course of time, though we have not sufficient evidence on this head. Habit in producing constitutional peculiarities, and use in strengthening, and disuse in weakening and diminishing organs, appear, in many cases, to have been potent in their effects. Homologous parts tend to vary in the same manner, and homologous parts tend to cohere. Modifications in hard parts and in external parts sometimes affect softer and internal parts. When one part is largely developed, perhaps it tends to draw nourishment from the adjoining parts, and every part of the structure which can be saved without detriment will be saved. Changes of structure at an early age may affect parts subsequently developed, and many cases of correlated variation, the nature of which we are unable to understand, undoubtedly occur. Multiple parts are variable in number and in structure, perhaps arising from such parts not having been closely specialized for any particular function, so that their modifications have not been closely checked by natural selection. It follows, probably from this same cause, that organic beings low in the scale are more variable than those standing higher in the scale, and which have their whole organization more specialized. Rudimentary organs, from being useless, are not regulated by natural selection, and hence are variable. Specific characters, that is, the characters which have come to differ since the several species of the same genus branched off from a common parent, are more variable than generic characters, or those which have long been inherited, and have not differed within this same period. In these remarks we have referred to special parts, or organs, being still variable, because they have recently varied, and thus come to differ. But we have also seen, in the second chapter, that the same principle applies to the whole individual. For in a district where many species of a genus are found, that is, where there has been much former variation and differentiation, or where the manufacture of new specific forms has been actively at work, in that district, and among these species, we now find, on an average, most varieties. Secondary sexual characters are highly variable, and such characters differ much in the species of the same group. Variability in the same parts of the organization has generally been taken advantage of in giving secondary sexual differences to the two sexes of the same species, and specific differences to the several species of the same genus. Any part or organ developed to an extraordinary size, or in an extraordinary manner, in comparison with the same part or organ in the allied species, must have gone through an extraordinary amount of modification since the genus arose, and thus we can understand why it should often still be variable in a much higher degree than other parts, for variation is a long, continued, and slow process, and natural selection will in such cases not as yet have had time to overcome the tendency to further variability, and to reversion to a less modified state. But when a species with an extraordinarily developed organ has become the parent of many modified descendants, which on our view must be a very slow process, requiring a long lapse of time, in this case, natural selection has succeeded in giving a fixed character to the organ, in however extraordinary a manner it may have been developed. Species inheriting nearly the same constitution from a common parent, and exposed to similar influences, naturally tend to present analogous variations, or these same species may occasionally revert to some of the characters of their ancient progenitors, although new and important modifications may not arise from reversion and analogous variation. Such modifications will add to the beautiful and harmonious diversity of nature, whatever the cause may be of each slight difference between the offspring and their parents, and a cause for each must exist. We have reason to believe that it is the steady accumulation of beneficial differences which has given rise to all the more important modifications of structure in relation to the habits of each species. End of Chapter 5, Part 2. This recording is in the public domain.